Brothers and sisters, today in our church here in San Clemente in Rome, we celebrate the feast of the dedication of the church. So when the church was first consecrated. And St. Thomas speaks really beautifully about, especially around the sacrament of the Eucharist, celebrating these holy sacred mysteries that become present to us in time. That when we enter the ritual of the Mass, we make contact with this ritual of the Mass, and Jesus is allowing us to have this most intimate experience of his life, and especially the height of it, his passion, and also his resurrection, his death. And so we too get to experience something of the fruits of his passion. We experience the great flow of grace coming from that Good Friday into our lives. And just like the disciples who were there on the cross, that we couldn't be there because we come 2,000 plus years later, but Christ, knowing how important it is for us to want to be in that moment with him, he makes miraculously somehow this moment become present to us in the celebration of the Mass, where we enter so deeply at Calvary. Calvary is not being repeated because it happened only once, but that sacrifice, that gift of love of Christ that he did when he was on the cross became an eternal moment, you could say, because he was human, but he was also God, and so he brought it into eternity. And somehow that is made present in the liturgy of the Mass. And so to have a church that's dedicated, consecrated for that purpose is of solemn use. And so, you know, it's just something I was reading in St. Thomas as well that really challenged me to greater reverence and to greater awareness of where we maybe celebrate Mass, you know, and so the things we use in the celebration of Mass, you know, and so whether we, you know, sometimes some of you might be Eucharistic ministers, some of you might be even priests or deacons, but if, you know, that to be fully conscious, especially if being two Eucharistic ministers, to be that full awareness of the sacred vessels, and you're bringing the Lord to people. Sometimes we might be bringing the Lord as ministers to the sick, you know, which is a great and noble service for our church, because the priest cannot be in every place possible, and so he has co-workers, you could say, faithful, who are willing to give this precious time up. But to be aware of how we carry the Lord to people, the sacredness of the host of Jesus himself, who has condescended himself in such a humble state, to be carried with dignity and love, and not maybe a casualness, but to really have that sense. And also the vessels that sometimes lay people are called to purify vessels, and it happens in parishes, churches, convents. And so that we have that awareness of that they're purified with the utmost care, and even the cloths that, you know, maybe just these are little things that maybe sometimes we're not aware of, but the cloths that we use for Mass, the purifiers, or the sacred cloths, they're to be, the church asks that they are left in water for 24 hours, so that any fragments of the Lord from the Eucharist may dissolve, any of his precious blood may dissolve, and then they're dried. And so it's just all these things that's just requests from the church to increase our love and our devotion and our sense and awareness, but also the reverence due to the fittingness of the reality of the Mass. And so the church is dedicated and consecrated because of the dignity of what happens in the church, the celebration of the sacraments, and obviously not the Mass only, but baptism, even it can be confession, obviously, the anointing of the sick, marriages, ordinations, etc. And St. Thomas says that there's a part there in where he talks about special consecration of a church. Also, the church is a place where you could say that when you go to a church, the Lord honors your pilgrimage to that place, but it's a place where, as in Ireland, you have that saying, it's a thin place. You know, there's a veil between heaven and earth, it's thin. It's almost like our voice is more clearly heard. Not so much because God cannot hear us in our hearts, because even St. Teresa of Avila says we don't need to shout to God. God fully hears us in the depths of the silence of our heart, but what matters is how we pray with tremendous faith. And nevertheless, churches are given you could say, a sacred place where our prayers take on even a greater power and an effect. And of course, in the prayers for the Mass, which we had to celebrate today, a special Mass for the dedication of the church, it speaks all about God dwelling in the house. And even the fact, the deep symbolism of how Christ really present in the Eucharist, God dwelling with us, is even a foreshadowing. The structure of a church, of a Catholic church with the tabernacle, where God dwelling with us, it's all pointing to the heavenly city in Jerusalem, where the saints and those gathered around the Lamb gather in perpetual adoration in heaven. And so the earthly church, the physical building, is just there because it's there so that we can come together and worship in a way full of dignity to the sacrament. But this idea that God dwells with us in the tabernacle, He's living with us, He's our light.